let's come to a square of attention, which is different from a frame. The mind, when it's trained and instructed, will make a frame which will have its images as its picture. And those images will cue in the feeling tones. And that feeling toned imagery is the base of the imagination. And the imagination is like an eye of the mind, which is erroneously called a third eye, which obtains in ancient India as a third eye in the goddess Durga, which is then a yogic bringing together of an ancient feminine goddess with a masculine insight image. And this is very difficult to reconcile with our recalibration. The ancient feminine wisdom sees very well with two eyes, with a context of the field of nature, so that the seeing is not a dualism, but is a pairing of closely modulated perspectives that can instantly not identify what it is looking at, but can instantly access the spontaneous field of nature, which, because it has a zero calibration, not a 0 point, a 0 point will vanish. There's no 0 point energy. It is a misconception. But that zero field will always entertain spontaneously a horizon of emergence, which is a two-way occurrence, a threshold where there can be an emergence into energy, or the energy can be absorbed into the zero field. And the feminine wisdom is that this comes naturally to her. In order to change what has emerged, first as energy and then as matter, first as time, then as space, which brings its integral 3 dimensions into play, so that the energy wave of time begins to gel as the particality of phenomenon, and you then can talk as old Albert Einstein did about space-time being a fabric which is integral, and that its integral quality is because the primordial energy of time is still rippling through the fabric of space-time and produces gravity waves. To look for the particality of gravity waves is a fool's errand. Now, the latest Daily Galaxy includes a lead article on unknown force may alter gravity at cosmologically large scales. Well, that's true, because space-time is cosmologically large. That's its scalar. The feminine spontaneous wisdom does not need a third eye in order to see that this context of the zero field of nature permeates everywhere, and permeates not as a vacuum, but as a fertile vacuum, as a fertility out of which energy, time, can spontaneously emerge. And when it does, when time has emerged, instantly, now the other three dimensions of space occur. And in that instantaneity, space gifts and gives over its phenomenality into particality, into the integral. And so the universe, the one place, the universe, gels faster than one can fraction primordiality. It's an immense quality of insight then, in order to understand transformation. That transformation is different from rearrangement. It's different from a lower quality of faux transformation, of being transmutation. This becomes that. Whereas a transformation is opening up the dimensions of all thises. And in order to do so, the plasma of this and that brought together to the ordering masculine mind needing to look for that third eye synthesis, which forever eludes it, has this quality where you begin to understand the great advance in alchemy in the world happened in the early 1st century AD in Alexandria. If you go to a resource like the classic A Source Book in Greek Science, Cohen and Drabkin, Harvard University Press, and by now many volumes on sourcing Greek science, you will find in these resources no discussion whatsoever of something which is simply available in Alchemy by E.J. Homyard, researching East and West alchemy, and you will find under Alchemy, page 48. The distillation transform is the most sophisticated transformation that there is. That once there has been a fermentation, the second transformation is a distillation. And in order to do this, you need to have what is popularly called, and was called then, the abbreviation of the process distillation, to a still. The still head, writes Homyard, was known as an ambix, but this name was often applied later to the still and still head as a whole, and has given rise, by way of the Arabic al-anbic, to our word alembic. Some still heads were provided with 2 or 3 spouts, and the apparatus was then described as a debicos, because the still head in Greek was a bikos, a dibikos, 2, or a tribikos, 3. And it's the tribikos that was the foundation of a new quality of distillation. In the bikos, and even in the bibikos, the distillation was popularly called a sand bath. It happened in terms of the dry sand. And this was like an inferior kind of an alchemy. You could do overlays and so forth. But the tribikos that came into play was the water bath. And the water bath gained its name en français as bain-marie, the bath of Maria. Marie, and the invention of the tribikos was ascribed to a woman alchemist, Mary the Jewess, traditionally supposed to be Miriam, sister of Moses, in a work passing under her name quoted by Zosimus, 3rd century AD. Instructions for making a tribikos are given. This tribikos, invented in early 1st century Alexandria by Mary the Jewess, was invented by Mary Magdalene. It is a difficulty when you do not have the ability to comb through history, because you do not have the combing instrument or technique, which is only available if you have the 5th dimension of vision. It is only with consciousness added to space-time that you put the thumb on the hand and you begin to get the ability to do the refined manipulation, creation, calibration, recalibration that allows then for science to occur out of history. And it's kin to how art occurs out of vision. And this pair of pairs of new dimensions, a 5th and 6th dimension, a 7th and 8th dimension, that gives then the 4 dimensions of the natural cycle, a whole ecology of the way in which the dimensions of consciousness come into play. In what we have been looking at for the last month or so, the wisdom of ancient India, the history of ancient India has come under enormous recalibration in the late 20th century and the early 21st century. Great genius has occurred to comb through what for a long time was considered settled excellence of research, and the whole research was based on the development of being able to develop the sciences of linguistics, of language, the sciences of archaeology, of anthropology, of psychology, and so forth. Whereas we know now, at this stage, just 14 years into the 21st century, that the recalibration is distilled to such a degree of refinement that the entire history of civilization needs to be rewritten. It has suffered a catastrophic collapse into a nightmare because it was a disturbed dream world in the first place, haunted by all kinds of fictitious, made-up chimeras that never obtained, and being lost in the dream world that now has turned into a nightmare, one even has a misunderstanding of chaos. In the ancient imagery of Egypt, the most primordial of all feminines was called in the 19th century chaos. She was portrayed as having a blue body that had little wavelets all the way through her body, because the feminine wisdom does not separate mind and body, does not separate spirit from mind and body. And to talk of spirit, mind, and body is to talk utter nonsense in the first place. Her body, her blue body, with all the little wavelets, is the primordial water before there is an element water. We today, for a long time, in physics call that a plasma. The primordiality is a plasma, highly ionized, that comes into swirling play and is not a chaos, but is the very source, quote, waters, out of which then, because it is not initially liquefied but is gaseous. And so a gaseous plasma, which also has that liquid quality to it, is that origin of the feminine wisdom that comes into play and is so misunderstood structurally, impeccably, not in ancient cultures, but in the development of those cultures that came together in multicultural contexts and developed then about 6,500 years ago, civilization. And so civilization needs to be recalibrated now. And that's what we're doing. Mary the Jewess, Mary Magdalene, is masterful at transformation in the sense of distilling. And one of the great sources of this is the Gospel according to Thomas, because it was Thomas who was sent to India. Arrangements were made in 36, 37 AD, and by 41 AD, circumstances had matured to where he could go, and went. The Gospel, according to Thomas, was recorded because he was charged, along with Matthew and Philip, the three of them together were like a tribekos, to keep the scalars of what was historically occurring, not historically occurring in some line, but in a seventh dimension quality that was being generated by sixth-dimensional art of spirit person, pilot wave people, and especially clustering around a pair of carrier wave persons, ushering in what in Greek is called a new aeon, a new time form in the frequencies of civilization. At the very end of the Gospel of Thomas, which was on purpose lost in the Western tradition, lost in the 4th century, the 300s, as many other things were lost and set aside and marginalized and was not found in terms of the West, until right at the close of World War II with the Nag Hammadi finds in Egypt. The very end of the Gospel of Thomas is this, 114 logoi. The logos is the word. The logos is the word which can have many facets to it, so that the logos is able to have someone who is a word cutter, a logos cutter, and can fashion language in its words, not just as vocabulary and grammar and syntax, but in its poetic as well. So that one then begins to speak the language using the word, plural, in a creative, imagining way, which then makes remembering as spontaneous as the creation that an artist has, because it is drawn not only out of the zero field of nature, but out of the infinite field of consciousness, paired together like two eyes, two fields, and the two fields in their encompassing complementarity generate a third field of the real. The third eye is not an eye, but is the actuality of reality. Here's the very end. The protagonists against Mary Magdalene were two, Peter and Paul. Simon Peter said to them, because Mary and Jesus were talking together, "Let Mary go out from among us, because women are not worthy of the life." Jesus said, "See, I shall lead her, so that I will make her male, that she too may become a living spirit." Not male so much as male as masculine, but become primordial man. And the Greek word for a living spirit is a pneuma. Pneumatic is a mechanical engineering term, but pneuma is a living spirit. It's not only spiritual, it's alive. It's living. It's life. And because it is a spirit, it has a six-dimensional quality to it. That is to say, it lives in vision as much as it lives in nature. It lives spontaneously in nature. It lives eternally in vision, not separated. For every woman who makes herself man, male, will enter the kingdom of heaven. The achievement is that the species being occurs in a shared way. And not to know that means you're not really living. The fertility comes from the sharingness in a spirit way. Yes, it does operate physiologically, biologically, but in the spirit way, it occurs in many scalars and variants. One can have shared presence. When I learned to meditate, I've mentioned a number of times, in Sequoia National Park in the 1960, I learned to meditate with the redwoods, the giant sequoia trees, and felt their kinship. Felt that my Sangha was the giant forest. Trees as old as civilization. So that the presence that is shared can be shared with all living things, any living things, any spiritual qualities of life itself. In the 21st of the 114 sayings, the logoi of Thomas, Mary said to Jesus, "Whom are thy disciples? Whom are thy disciples like?" He said, "They are like little children who have installed themselves in a field which is not theirs." The field of nature, that zero field. The field of vision, that infinite field. Supposedly, then, the field of the real. Have installed themselves in a field which is not theirs. When the owners of the field come, they will say, "Release to us our field." They take off their clothes before them to release it to them and to give back their field to them. Therefore I say, if the Lord of the house knows that the thief is coming, he will stay where he comes and will not let him dig through into his house of his kingdom to carry away the goods. You then must watch, for the world. Gird up your loins with great strength, lest the brigands find way to come to you, because they will find the advantage which you expect. Let there be among you a man of understanding. When the fruit ripened, he came quickly with his sickle in his hand. He reaped it. Whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. Here is the sickle for the full heads of grain in the fields of the real. This quality shows itself again and again in the way in which in our time, most of us who are paying attention to this now for half a century or more, go back to the late 30s, early 1940s, and understand that there was an enormous shaking of the plasma of civilization at that time, that the rumblings had come some 3 generations before, had been signaled referentially a couple of centuries before, had had its own kind of apocalyptic millennial thing almost 1,000 years before, had its own aeon occurrence some 2,000 years before, but very few people could read the time, did not know what time it was in civilization, had no idea whatsoever, had various plans of schemata and so forth. Almost none of it was real. When there was a concerted effort in 1941 to confront what had become a world nightmare. Not only that the Nazi nightmare had not only taken over almost all of Europe by that time, but was busy bombing London in order to take over Britain at the time, at that moment, France having fallen just a few months before in October 1940. And at the very same time, the Japanese imperial military, linked together with the fascists in Europe, not only the Nazis in Germany, but also in Italy, in many other countries allied with it, fighting even against the fascist left wing of Stalin in the communist Soviet Union. But the whole world seemed on the brink where everything was collapsing, and the only thing that was left as possible fair game would be the Americas. It was exactly at that time in India that this beautiful esoteric little book was published in 1941. The only copy was in a Maharaja's ancient library in Sanskrit, and in order to publish the Sanskrit volume, because it was very, very rare, a young genius was taken. He couldn't go home to Italy because of the Mussolini fascist takeover of Italy, and so in India, as the guest of the Maharaja, who was the one who showed him his great library, and Mario Corelli, doctor of literature, very educated, made a translation of this document and wrote an introduction to it, and it was published in Baroda, which is in North India, north of Bombay, in the Gaikwad's Oriental series. That is the Maharaja Gaikwad of Baroda. And this is actually the Maharaja's own copy, which I received a long time ago, and it's signed by the author to His Majesty. From the author, it is a translation from the Sanskrit of a manual of baptism written by the great Vajrayana genius Naropa, who's one of the founders of Vajrayana Buddhism and was the great Indian sage of the day. And the 6 yogas of Naropa are the very foundation of the practice of the way in which the Mahayana blossomed out into the Vajrayana 1,000 years ago. And this is the only copy of Naropa's manual of baptism on record. And this is the only English translation. This is the only copy I've ever seen of this. In Sanskrit, as the author writes, as I have said formerly, this text is a tika. A tika is a short explanation of the treatise on the Sika, Sikodesa, and the word Sika means the same as Abe Sika, which occurs often in epic and dramatic poetry as well as in law codes. Most usually, Sika is the ceremony of unction, which is performed on the head of every new king with water, and it is a baptism having 2 functional related ways. The king who comes newly must be baptized, but the deeper thing is that baptism is a holy function, a spiritual function that comes as a Christian origin. And that Christian origin, not specified in here, actually was from Thomas, who brought it from ancient Palestine with him, because the Jordan River ford is where this entire Sika quality came to a special penetrating threshold with the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist. And all of this carried to India, and 1,000 years later, occurring with Naropa, and 1,000 years after that, I'm presenting this to you in this way. Let's take a little break, get our breaths, and then come back renewed. Let's come back to our square of attention. Not a frame of reference, but a square as a geometry of a focus which is not ambivalent but omnibivalent, capable of taking in gunfighter style the entire context so that one can see motion even this far aside, but can be zeroed instantly and can be absorbed spontaneously and emerged in the same way. It's called Zen. We've been looking at why the summer of 2014 is increasingly an enormous pregnant threshold of fertility giving emergence, giving birth in a big way, which is an emergence, the coming forth by day, coming forth by time, form. We have several presentations ago showed this is the first of 3 volumes of the first real translation of the Rig Veda into English, of the first translation of the Rig Veda into any other language than Sanskrit, to the perfection of the ability of decades. The head translator, Stephanie W. Jameson, is at UCLA, right here in town, here in Los Angeles, has done many volumes, and I brought a couple of them here. And in 2014, this translation just came out, and next week, hopefully, I'll show you 3 volumes that just now the 3rd volume brought out in 2014 in the Netherlands, Leiden, Holland, by Brill, on the first calibration of Ajanta caves in India that clears up, like the Rig Veda translation clears up, at least 3,500 years of progressive misunderstandings. The 3 volumes on Ajanta clear up for the first time in almost 2,000 years the incredible story of how the genius of a 9-dimensional complementarity occurs so rare, it's like a jewel time in the time forms of civilization, where the creme de la creme has turned into the butter, the ghee, that allows one to have the real sacrifice that now has the efficacy to bring into play that which is so crucially needed, the release from the nightmare, the resolving of what was not only an impasse, but a chaotic cacophony of impasses that became like a swamp, like a dismal miasma. We can do that. With the Rig Veda, one of the earliest presentations of understanding that the Rig Veda had a very special use of language is this little pamphlet, booklet, published in London by Luzak and Company, The Rig Veda as Landnama Book, Ananda K. Kumarswarmi. And this was published on 46 Great Russell Street, 1935. Great Russell Street is where the British Museum is, where Bloomsbury and all of its literary group hung out and so forth. I showed a couple of presentations ago the 3-volume selection of the works of Ananda Kumarswarmi, published in the Vologen series. And it's important, I urged everyone to consider that the Vologen series was conceived by a woman, Mary Mellon, and her relationship with Carl Jung is one of the prized things in this little book that Chiron Publishing puts out. And they're essentially, they were a Toronto Canadian. This is published in the United States, but was for very rare Jung Association members around the world to read in English, limited edition quality things. Mary Mellon was the one who founded the Vologen series with her husband Paul Mellon, who was the son of the great wealthy philanthropist Andrew Mellon. And one of the 100 Roman numeral volumes and sets in the Vologen series is the Mellon Lectures in Fine Art in Washington, D.C., and they're still going on now. There must be into the 50th volumes. The original volume came out in 1943, which I showed last week. But it is the Vologen series that came out in the early 1940s, and towards the end of the 1940s, another woman got the idea of doing a world-class series of bringing together the creme de la creme of the whole planet's heritage to make a series, and it was called the World Perspectives series. Her name is Ruth Nanda, Ruth Nanda Ashen. This one is called Mysticism, Christian and Buddhist by D.T. Suzuki. Daisetsu Tataro Suzuki. Daisetsu in Japanese means humble, most humble. So Tataro Suzuki got the appellation of Daisetsu because he was enormously humble. He lived to be 97 years old in Kyoto. He married a British woman, Beatrice Lane. And Beatrice Lane Suzuki was an extremely wonderful, quiet woman. There are photos of her in her kimono holding her cats. She loved cats and loved D.T. Suzuki as well. The board of directors and editors of World Perspectives, Niels Bohr, Richard Courant, who is one of the great famous mathematicians and histories of mathematics, Hu She, who was one of the great Chinese intellectuals, a close friend of John Dewey and Bertrand Russell, Jacques Maritain, a French Catholic intellectual, J. Robert Oppenheimer, I. Rabi, Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, and so forth. You find in this series the same thing that you find in the Vologen series, that the feminine wisdom understands that what is wrong is that the entire nightmare is due to an entire contaminated physiology that leads to a dream fretting world that has nightmares like reoccurring cyclones going through them, hurricanes going through them, tornadoes going through them, and that there's no end to this unless we wake up. Only that break in the curse, which occurs because the time form is not recognized. It all comes back to the very fact that there is a moment, and that moment is like a trigger. That awakening moment is like a trigger that stops the nightmare because it vanishes. Yes, it leaves a lingering for a while, but the nightmare is over. The burner is turned off. The boiling pot will stop. The whistling kettle will quiet itself down. In Kumerswary's great little book from the mid-1930s, and you have to understand that London by 1935 was being threatened by the Nazis physically in the form of beginning to have the threat, if you do not understand that we are an inevitable Third Reich, we will take you apart in the rest of Europe. He writes about the first sacrifice with capital letters, the Rig Veda being the origin of the Vedas, and that the Vedas are held together not only by the different hymns of the Rig Veda, the 1,028 hymns in 10 mandalas and various other sections, and last week's presentation has a number of those kinds of bits of information. The first sacrifice has been referred to. In the singular, it will, however, be understood that this is in a collective sense. The sacrifice actually consists of many parts and distinct celebrations. In any case, it is by means of this 1,000-year session that the all emanators, in Sanskrit, the Vishva Raja, all of the emanations have a scalar field which can only occur phenomenally in even a universe which can only occur phenomenally of a zero field of nature, Mother Nature, called in Sanskrit Prakriti. I used to call her Ma Prakriti. And Purusha, which is the infinite field of consciousness. When they are eye to eye to eye to eye, one wakens. The nightmare is over. The healing can begin. The first sacrifice is all about that and is held not only after 1,000 years, but is especially powerful when held after a pair of 1,000 years, an aeon. What about this first sacrifice? All the powers participating in this act of creation, because the sacrifice is for an act of creation, of emergence. And in order for the emergence to occur, the fields must be fertile. And for it to be real, both fields must be fertile, shared. Doesn't matter if you have the ingredients, if you don't have the stove, if you don't have the fire. If Agni is not present, you're not going to have anything. that's able to be edible. The occasion of the first sacrifice, it's in, they use the Sanskrit here. It, in principle, is at the beginning of an aeon, the birthday of the supernal sun, the springtime of the cosmic year, when dawn first shone for man. Man is capitalized because it isn't just that there are people, it is that there are conscious people in space-time who are personal, which means that they have emerged out of a quintessential five-dimensional vision space-time into the art of person-making. And that art of person-making is there because at this particular aeon they learn to read. They learn to read a written language, which means that, comme ci, comme ça, someone has learned to write. If someone can write a language, instead of there just being a sound of language, there's a resounding of language in the reading, and you can read it out loud to hear it, but you can read it not so much silently, but internally, so that what occurs then is the expansion of the mind from its frame of references to its square of attention, which can be shifted and opened, and that square can be opened to a field. And that field of vision then, in that five-dimensional quintessential, is the way in which nature wakens to the possibility that we can now have a cosmic sharing. Mother Nature understands that a father consciousness is interested, and interested in her. When the doors of the worlds to come open for you their months and years, and ancient are all these things. And so it is this quality that occurs. And that first sacrifice in 2014 is that the Rig Veda for the first time can be read in English and read out loud in English, and its whole variegated structure can be now appreciated, can be understood, just like at the very same time that this happened, the third volume published by Brill in the Netherlands on the Ajanta caves has been completed. And now we have the Rig Veda and the Ajanta caves available so that we can understand how precious a jewel of a time form that has matured if someone can read it, if someone can speak it, if someone can hear it. If you have ears to hear, now's the time to hear it. If you have not a third eye, but you have a whole open scalar of nature and consciousness as paired, shared fields, the field of the real is available faster than instantaneous, spontaneously. This is what the presentations are all about. And so there are many cognate things. In India, the great pioneering of Malate J. Shenge, bringing the Rig Veda into play in terms of the ancient India civilization. The Rig Veda is about 1500 BC, And some 1,500 years before that, the Harappan civilization. Harappa was a huge city of about 500,000 people, and Mohenjo-Daro was even older at about 500,000 people. They were on the Indus River, and that whole civilization spread because they were not after conquest in terms of armies. There was no warrior class in ancient India. That was brought into India by those who were outside of India. In ancient India, one does not find chariots. The whole appearance of chariots is a sign that people who knew about horses and wheels had come into India from outside of India. You do not find horses and chariots in ancient India of, say, 2500 BC. Just like you don't find horses and chariots in ancient Sumer and Akkad, or in Egypt of 2500 BC. There are no horses teamed up in huge teams to pull the blocks for building the pyramids. There are no overseers in their chariots whipping the masses to build those pyramids. Those horses, those chariots are invented in Central Asia, are made by people that had huge caravan routes that led from the region on the Darya River. It used to be called the Oxus River by the Greeks, all the way to China. Their caravan routes went thousands and thousands of miles through the Hindu Kush, through that curvature of the last of the Himalayas, dropping down into the Gobi Desert, at first in a southern route that went along the mountain range called the Kunlun Mountains, the Dragon Mountains. On the other side of the Gobi are the Tian Shan, the Heavenly Mountains. And the first time that you find chariots in China is the beginning of dynastic China. But 2100 BC. First time you find horses and chariots and jade in China is the first dynasty, the Xia dynasty, which has purposely been kept like a ghost dynasty. We don't know too much about it, they say. We know about the inheritors who displaced the Xia, the Shang, because they were warriors, man. They made bronze and brass, and they were tough. They were there for a long time. They made their dynasty about the same time that the Rig Veda was written in India, about 1500 BC, but 600 years before then. It's when, for the first time, you find jade, horses, and chariots in China, and also a whole passel full of plants. One of the outstanding plants that was never there in China was the peach. Another was the rose. They were all brought from what we used to call Persia, which were not originally just cultivated there, but cultivated in Central Asia and brought down through what we call Persia into India and across in the northern caravan routes all the way to China. And on the way, because the caravan route went along the Kunlun mountain range, the big city trading post was Khotan, ancient Khotan, where two great rivers came down out of the Kunlun mountains carrying raw jade fragments. One of them had white jade, and the other had what is called black jade, a dark spinach green, and the other a very translucent white. And those two kinds of jade were paired with the horses and the chariots and taken into China and founded dynastic China, because there were no dynasties before that, the age of kings. So that the whole idea of India and of China, of Central Asia, of the way in which the caravan routes, before there were chariots, before there were horses, extended all the way to the west, the far west, so that one had the development of thousands and thousands of years of persons who had red hair, who went into the far reaches of the west as far as Ireland. And there, about 3200 BC, is the first time that you have New Grange built as this huge place of a first sacrifice that could be offered every year at the longest night of the year, the winter solstice, for the sunrise of the winter solstice leading towards the inevitable. If this sun comes up this morning, spring cannot be far behind. 5,000 years ago or more. It is this quality of understanding that civilization has its time, form, energy, frequencies, and like an energy frequency, it is able to have its shifts in calibration. And so a recalibration that is really monumental is able to take off the frames of reference, to open out the square of attention so that the entire fields of nature and its dimensions and consciousness and its ecology of dimensions can come together in that great transformative third field of the real. Then we have something where we can unseal the glyphic languages of the ancients and understand what it was that they were bequesting. And the true nature is that, like in India, very often, like with the Bollingen series with Mary Mellon, like with the World Perspectives series with Ruth Nanda Ashen, the American woman who founded the first school for nurses, the American woman who founded the Red Cross, that the feminine wisdom is constantly bringing the communities of infinitely expandable conscious natural cycle livers to that threshold where life now begins to have the qualities where it has its fruition, where the fertility is not futility, where birth is no longer an entrance into the nightmare, but it becomes more than just a planet. It becomes a locus of an entire starry system, so that what used to be called chaos, really being plasma, that primordial feminine goddess now has the spangle of all the stars on her body, like Nut, or has the stars made into the points, like Sheshat, who is the goddess who is the way in which the beginnings of written language are refined to be able to preserve life of the person into eternity. That the entrance of a living person into the field of the real, which is eternal, in its 11-dimensional fertility, a real strength theory. It is this quality that the feminine wisdom brings into play, especially in times where a first sacrifice of a new time form must be successful. We know from Ajanta now in 2014 that it had 2 short bursts of a couple of generations each, and that was it. And that the second burst was one of the high watermarks of art in all of world civilization. And it lasted only for 80 years. Before then, it had fallen into great decay for about 200 years from an earlier couple of generations of genius. And after about 3 generations, 25 years to a generation, when the last inheritor king, Harisena, died, all the wealthy patrons that were collected under the aegis of these 3 generations coming to an end with Harisena's death, they all decided to put their money and their patronage and scattered other places that were selfish, and Ajanta quickly was abandoned. And for about 100, 150 years, this or that bandit lord, warlord, would commission little sculptures to be put into fast decaying 30 caves of Ajanta, some of them interrupted mid-carving, and they were not carved in this great flint rock cliff face from the beginning. They were carved from the top because an entire terrace was made into about 100 and some feet, so that you had this huge terrace about 50 feet above where the other rock cliff went down another 100 feet or so to the Warhoga River that carved in this horseshoe, this ancient volcanic layers of hard rock from the Cretaceous period, and they bored from the top and made the caves coming as a pivot spinning inside, where they began to carve meticulously the visionary architecture of 2 kinds of temples, one for a presencing of the Buddha in his great Mahayana cosmic expansion of the calibration of nirvana into a maha-nirvana. And the other, those were called chaityas in Sanskrit, and the other is the vihara, where the collection of those who devoted themselves to maintaining all of this, of presenting the ongoing complexity of the sacrifices, and these, all of these. There were 3 great chaityas and 3 more being built when everything came to a close, and all the rest were viharas of communities that also put up those who came on pilgrimage to see. One of the great Chinese pilgrims, Fa Hien, visited Ajanta in the 400s AD. Next week I'll bring a English translation from about 125 years ago of very rare of his travel log. From 400 AD to about 475 AD, when King Harisena died. And Ajanta was not discovered again until 1819. For almost 1,300 years, it went back to the jungle, the bats, the monkeys, the mold. Because no one knew how to appreciate what it had shown in its radiance. One can go back to something that is even more barbaric than primitive, because the primitive can always be absorbed into the primordial. One can find a way to go back into nature and become primordial again, like a Thoreau doing his American Indian Vision quest at Walden and learning, even when all the ground is covered with snow and you can't get out of the door, you can't look through the windows, you can go to the fireplace and you can look up through the flue of the fireplace and see the square of attention of the blue sky that's above the snowy forest. More next week.